Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming this evening. This is the September 28th meeting of the Barren County Historical Society. I'm Aaron Reese, Vice President of the Historical Society, and before we begin, I'd like to take a moment and thank the members of the Society. Your contributions help to preserve and promote history in Barren County, so we appreciate everything you do for us. And if you're a new guest tonight, we really appreciate you being here. Love the crowd, love seeing a big crowd get out. We do this every month, fourth Thursday of the month, so please come back and see us. Tonight, we've got our President, Sam Terry. He is reading we're going over the Fort Williams letters. George Messer's Civil War correspondence, letters to his wife. So we're really looking forward to a great meeting here. And without further ado, Sam Terry.
Thank you all, and thank you for coming tonight. Can you all hear me back in the back? Okay. A little bit of background about these letters. They came from an unusual source, perhaps. In that, I first spotted one of these letters on eBay. And then there was another one. And so Judge Benny Dickinson and I put our heads and our money together and said, let's buy as many of these letters as possible because they were mailed from Glasgow. They were written from Fort Williams and about Fort Williams, and they need to be here, not being sold on eBay. What we didn't know at the time about all of that was that there was a whole collection of these letters. We got quite a few of them, but not all of them. But we do have scans of all of them. So that's a little bit about how this all started. Nearly all of these letters are by a man named George Messer. They were written to his wife Lottie. Her true name was Charlotte, but she's always referenced as Lottie in the letters. And you can see the postmark on this letter is from Glasgow, Kentucky. In July 1863, that was one of the very last letters he wrote from Fort Williams. So when we got the letters, we didn't know who this soldier was. So a little research has revealed several interesting things. One, we know that George was born in 1833 in Ohio. He had a sister, Rebecca, who married a man named David Bell in Ohio. He left Ohio and moved in the 1850s to the Creek Township in DeWitt County, Illinois. Married Charlotte in 1860, so they were still newlyweds of sorts when all of this started. And that he worked as a carpenter. He had dark hair and blue eyes. He was mustered in September the 4th, 1862 at Camp Butler, Illinois. And he was in Company F, the 107th Regiment of the Illinois Volunteer Infantry. There are 82 letters total. 6 of the letters Lottie wrote to George, and you'll learn more about those letters a little bit later. There are 8 letters George wrote to his father-in-law, Alexander Kelly, and his brother-in-law, Thomas Kelly. 6 of the letters from Lottie are to her nephew, William Wesley McNulty, who also served in the 107th, and he was with George the entire time. So he was a little bit younger, and George viewed him, per the letters, as like a little brother or a nephew. And he was his wife's nephew. The letters range from 1 page in length to 12 pages. They're various sizes. Some are in pencil, some are in ink, 3 on decorative envelopes. And he wrote his wife roughly twice a week or more on occasion. That's the whole collection. And that's as near as we got to getting all the letters, was a picture of them. Which was kind of a cruel thing, but I'm glad we know, but you get an idea. So who's who in these letters that we'll encounter? One, this is a photograph of George. Based on the letters, this photograph was made at Fort Williams. He writes to Lottie that he had his likeness made and he was sending her one of the photographs of himself. He's the primary writer of the letters. Charlotte, Lottie, is his wife. They had a daughter. They had an interesting way of dealing with names in their little family. Their daughter's name was Katie, but they called her Cutie. And unfortunately, early on in the letters in 1862, Cutie dies. They also had a son who was an infant at the time George left for service. You can see he was born August the 21st of 1862, and George was mustered in September 4th. So not much time. His name was William Alexander Messer, and they called him Eddie. Kind of like Cutie. There's also a mention of William H. Messer, who was George's father, and he's simply referred to as the old man. He did not have a good relationship with his father. His mother had passed away, and there was controversy about her property that George felt he was entitled to some portion of. This fellow with him was William Wesley McNulty, and this is young William. As I said earlier, he's a nephew of Lottie. Sometimes he's referred to as Wesley, sometimes as West with a T, sometimes as Wes. He was born in 1844, so he was a pretty young man when he was in Glasgow in 1863. He was 5'6", with light hair, blue eyes, and he enlisted at the same time George did, and from their letters, it appears that they were bunkmates and they were close buddies the entire time. Interestingly, I can't find out anything about George or Wesley's mother, but she was married to a man by the name of McNulty, who was an alleged philanderer in Ohio. So that's been a dead end so far. Here's an example of one of the letters that George wrote. This one is postmarked from Woodsonville, Kentucky, in February of 1863, addressed to Lottie. This gives you an idea of the letters. George wrote pretty well, penmanship-wise. He also wrote well as far as grammar was concerned, so we can assume that George had a good, solid education, or he wouldn't be writing all of these letters. We also learn from these letters that George was making extra money in camp by writing letters for men who could not read or write. And so he was getting an extra 50 cents or something for writing someone's letter. He was also helping to write out the payroll for the entire company. So he had some responsibilities. He was not just a rank and file soldier. The other thing that I want you to notice at the very top of the page of this letter is it says letter number 2. Early on, George has this ingenious idea, and he tells Lottie, I want you to start numbering your letters, and I'm going to number my letters, and that way we each can know if we didn't get a letter. And it makes perfect sense. And there are gaps in the letters. George has a letter that was number 22, and then there's not another one till letter 28. So there are indeed gaps in those letters. By contrast, this is a letter from Lottie to George. Her penmanship wasn't nearly as nice as George's, and her grammar is not as good, but she did write to him, and there was a collection of her letters to him that he had with him during his time in the war. So I've grouped the letters into some locations. The first group began in 1862 from Camp Butler in Illinois. He then goes to Louisville, Kentucky, and that began November the 30th. Then he was in a place called Camp Hell Hollow, and I haven't been able to find where Camp Hell Hollow was. Camp Weller was somewhere south of Louisville, Elizabethtown. He was there in December of 1862. He finally reaches Mumfordville, Kentucky on December the 12th, and he's there for 2 days. And he writes to her about the fact that there had been a recent battle there, and there was a lot of devastation, a lot of downed trees, burned fences, just a disaster area, if you will, from that battle. Then we have letters from Woodsonville. He was there for 91 days, so there were several Woodsonville letters that began. It's a sample of one of the letters from Woodsonville. One of the fabulous things that George did was he also included sketches of things he was writing about. That is the bridge in Mumfordville in one of his letters. He's also showing where there are avenues within their camp, and he wants her to know what camp life is like, which is pretty fascinating. And then March the 17th of 1863, George gets to what will become Fort Williams. At the time they arrived, there was nothing there. So, skip over just a bit. I want you to hear some of what he writes from Woodsonville, because it helps to set the scene for what's going on here. This is written December the 16th of 1862 from Woodsonville. You wanted to know what I meant by shebang. It is a phrase used by the soldiers when it means their tent or quarters. Our shebang here is not so good as it was at Camp Weller, but we commenced today to build winter quarters by order of the Lieutenant Colonel. There was a great fire in Woodsonville last night. There were 2 hospitals burned down, but they saved all the sick men. A large number, too. It was an awful night for a sick man to turn out. The buildings caught fire by a falling stovepipe. I was out over the battleground where old Bragg and Morgan fought some of our men last fall. The trees are riddled in all directions by cannon, grape, and musket balls. The timber is about all cut down for a half mile. The country here is very rough and broken, and farmers have not even attempted to raise very much here for the last year by the appearance of the country. Do not be uneasy about me being out of money. Money's an ongoing theme in George's letters. And he says, I spent money pretty fast coming down to camp from home, for while I was in Louisville, the fare was so bad that I had to buy what I lived on there. Since I got to camp, I've only spent 75 cents, and that was 25 cents for paper and envelopes, and 50 cents today for chickens and pies. Cooked chickens are worth 15 cents and pies 10 cents, and they're good too. I have $10.50 yet, which will last me some time yet until I draw, which won't be very long, I think. I counted 200 and over government wagons and ambulances pass here yesterday and today on their way to Nashville, and a great many more to pass tomorrow. It is reported that a large force on the march to from Louisville on their way to the south. I also saw a regiment of cavalry pass yesterday in advance of the train. He always inserts some humorous things in there in his letters, and I'm not reading the family information in the letters, but he says, Wesley, Lottie's nephew, says to tell you that he is fat, ragged, and saucy, and is getting considerable beard, and also sends his compliments to Vinia for the apples she sent him. We can buy apples here, but they are very inferior. I think that it will be no use to send any provision, and it's very hard to get anything through. Major Kelly started with the box and could not get it farther than Louisville. If you've not sent any when you get this, don't send any, for it is doubtful whether I would ever get it. Then, if you're a student of John Hunt Morgan in the Civil War in this area, you know about the Christmas raid, and that it tied up all communication for a lengthy period of time. But the interesting thing was, George didn't know about that in that context, but on January the 2nd of 1863, he's still in Woodsonville, and he says, I've not had a chance to send any word since the 24th of December, since mail was cut off by John Morgan and Nathan Bedford Forrest. They have been watching, we have been watching for them ever since, and our outposts have been skirmishing with some of them. We have had to stand by our breastworks for most of the time. They have taken the regiment that took our place at Elizabethtown, and Captain Wismer along with them. Small loss he is too. The one and only person that George ever has anything bad to say is Captain Wismer. And Wismer had all kinds of things that George did not care for. They burned all the bridges and trestles between here and Colesburg and done considerable damage. Our forces are after them now. I've not heard so much of any results. And 2 days later, January 4th, before he's going to get to Glasgow, he says, I seat myself to write you a few lines on this Sabbath morning to let you know how things are working in this God-forsaken country, and to let you know that I am as hearty as I ever was in my life, and I would be very glad to hear that you was the same. It's been about 2 weeks since I've had any word from you, and it has been nearly that long since I wrote to you from the fact that all communication was cut off between here and Louisville the 26th of December. And this morning was the first mail that left this place since Christmas. I sent you a letter this morning's mail, and I'll send you another letter in tomorrow's mail. We had an exciting time here the last 2 weeks. We were called out every night in line of battle, and some nights 2 or 3 times. The rebels would attack our outpost. They would send the alarm. Then you could see a rush to get out. Company F was beat but once, and then by one company only, and that was Company E from Monticello. We have not had a man up here to lag behind. Still in Woodsonville, he says, we have a mess now with 11 officers, and we have hired a cook, J.W. Rogers, to cook for us. He's a very good one, too. We have for breakfast, as a general thing, coffee, crackers, smoked side meat commonly called sow belly. Our dish for dinner, and by the way, it is my favorite, is fat beef and beans boiled together, and sometimes the same for supper, omitting the beans and substituting fried hominy in their place. We have at every meal hot coffee and sugar to sweeten it. We sometimes draw molasses and rice, so you can see that the variety is not very great. There's another dish that I must tell you about. We commonly call it hash. It is made after this fashion. We take fat meat and cut it in small pieces, take crackers and break them up as fine as we can, pour some water over it, meat and all. Then broil it until the meat is done, dish it up with a little sugar and molasses over it, and it makes a splendid dish. We frequently change the variety by adding a little fresh pork, mutton, chickens, etc., which, by the way, never costs us anything very much except for going after them. And he makes references. He never says they stole all this food, but he will reference that as we acquired. And he was quite proud at one point that while he was in Mumfordville, the one thing he did there was he spent a quarter and bought a skillet. We don't necessarily think of needing a skillet if we're fighting in the Civil War, but George did. In January, he's writing about the fact that we have 8 inches of snow on the ground, and it's no fun to sleep on the snow, and then the rain comes. So he and Wesley found boards and created a bunk for themselves so that they were up off of the cold ground and not on the damp earth so much. Some other interesting things we don't think about in these camps. This was February. He says, I must tell you that we have had some of the best music that is scared up most anywhere. There is the best violin player here in the 5th Indiana Cavalry that I ever heard in my life. He's playing now in the tent next to mine. Our regiment and the Indiana Cavalry can raise a full string band, violin, banjo, guitar, and bass viola. Then, with as good vocal music as can be scared up anywhere, we sometimes have a nice time. I was on picket the other night and was stationed in front of a house where lived a family of Union people, and these boys that I spoke of came there to serenade them. They laid down, and Wesley was on guard when they come. They first commenced to play, and then they sung a patriotic song, America, the gem of the wide world. I thought it was the nicest music I ever heard. At the house I spoke of, there are two very old people. They are somewhere in nearly 70 years of age. The old man says that he was well off 3 years ago, but the rebels have taken nearly all that he has. There's hardly ever a day but Uncle Davy, as he is called, and the old lady sends the boys on picket by his house a basket full of biscuit for our dinner. He is no halfway Union man. He also writes to Lottie describing what happened to deserters in their company. He says, we had another man to desert from our company last night. His name is Willis Greer. He was detailed and sent to guard a bridge at Bacon Creek. He is gone and no one knows where he went. There will be plenty of that to go the same way pretty soon unless authorities will allow furloughs to be granted. But you need not look for me home unless I can come without being branded as a deserter. They have got pretty strict about French furloughs. They are in the habit of stopping their pay for about 3 months and branding them on the right hip in the shape of the letter D with indelible ink. There's some talk of sending a squad of the men home after the boys have taken the liberty to go home. David Willis has been found out, and he is about 50 miles from here, and he will be punished. Same letter, late February 1863. There is great dissatisfaction in our army on account of the President's proclamation. Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. They say they did not volunteer to fight to free the Negroes. And there are some of our regiment and some from the neighborhood of Marion that are in our company that have threatened to throw down their arms if that's what they have to do. You can now have some idea of how things is working down here, and the dissatisfaction is a great deal worse among the Kentucky soldiers than it is ours. For my own part, I have nothing to say. I am here for the purpose of obeying the commands of the President and my superior officers, so there is no use of making a fuss about it. We are all into the scrape, and there is no use trying to get out of it until the time comes. I find that is the best way to say nothing and keep on thinking. The last letter that he writes from Hart County, he includes some information about a camp funeral. He didn't think too highly of the chaplain in the camp either. He said he was gone most of the time and no one seemed to put any faith in his words. So he was not impressed. And he says, there was a rather serious accident here this afternoon. There was some cavalry crossing the railroad bridge and leading their horses when one of the horses became frightened and knocked the man off. He fell about 115 feet into the water of Green River and sank out of sight to rise no more. He has not been found yet. It is very dangerous crossing with horses on such a narrow place, and so high too. Some of the boys saw him fall to his untimely grave. So March 17th, 1863 arrives, and George comes to Glasgow. And here's what he tells Lottie about that. He says, we started from our old camp near Woodsonville on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock and marched 7 miles by 12 o'clock. We then rested near 2 hours and took up our forward march and only marched 4 miles and halted for the night and had an incident occur I must tell you something about. As we marched over the top of the hill, we looked ahead and saw the splendid American flag floating from the top of the house by the roadside. The first banner of liberty I have seen displayed by citizens since I came to Kentucky, and I believe it made every soldier's heart thrill with joy. We camped for the night close by that house, and I never saw men behave so well in camp since I've been in the Army. I went with some of the boys to serenade this worthy family, and after the boys had sung and played, there was a lady come to the window and sung one song to the tune of Dixie. It was entirely new to us, and every line was patriotic and noble. We marched again at 6 o'clock in the morning and arrived at our present camp yesterday precisely at 3 o'clock, and we now have one of the nicest and cleanest camps I ever saw. It is entirely new. It is on high rolling ground, and there's 2 good springs within 200 yards of the camp. I think it will be a healthy place, and we began to fix up this morning, making ourselves as comfortable as possible. So you know the hill where they are if you've been to Fort Williams. He mentions in that same letter that he's planning to have his likeness taken. He continues, we have no fortifications here to protect us like we had at Woodsonville, but there is a fort laid off here, and I suppose that we will have to help build the fort. There's 2 other regiments to be here in a day or 2 to help. It is a natural fortification. The timber and brush is so thick that an enemy could not begin to get to us. The underbrush is covered all over with green briars as thick as they can be in many places. When the fort is complete, it will hold 8 siege guns, and it is in such a position that it would be very hard to take. Colonel Joseph Kelly is the commander of the place, and everybody that loves him and that knows him, they would suffer almost everything before they would disobey any of his commands. He is the right man at the right place. Our regiment got the name of being the best behaved regiment that ever marched along the pike from Mumfordville. It is a name we are proud of too, and I think we will try to keep the good name that we are justly entitled to. I must stop, for it is dark, and I can't see to read or write. If I can get a candle, I will try and write some more tonight, but for a little while, my love, goodbye, and a kiss for you and my big boy far away from home. It is dark. George. Well, apparently he found a candle, because he continues right after that. I have made a raise of a light and will proceed to finish my letter tonight, for tomorrow we will be busy fixing up our quarters and the color line. I must tell you about something about the town that we are encamped by. It is the county seat of Barren County, and it is very nicely laid out and contains a population of about 4,000. The place contains some very good buildings, a very fine seminary. It is on pretty high ground, but our camp looks down on the town as though it was down in a valley. There's a great many secesh around here, and there's scouts of the enemy prowling around all the time, and it is dangerous to go a mile from camp unless we go in squads and armed. Our cavalry are catching them all the time. So you can see that we are not quite as safe here as we were at Camp Butler, but we don't fear them. Let them come on. They will find the 107th Illinois will not be a disgrace to the brave patriots that have gone from little DeWitt, Illinois before us, and we have never had a chance to show what we could do. Neither do we care about it unless it should be necessary, for I have no desire to engage in mortal combat with my fellow man. There is at present one regiment of cavalry stationed here. They have 12 companies and 1,100 fighting men nearby. We have fewer sick men in our regiment than there's been since we left Camp Butler. It's going to be very warm here this summer, surrounded on 3 sides by heavy timber, but that we have to cut down and give our guns better range. I'm not sorry we left our old camp at Bunkerville on the Green River, for there was an immense amount of filth that had collected there and would soon have become very unhealthy, and here we have a clean, nice camp, plenty of water, which is very essential to the health of the soldier. The only disadvantage we have here is on account of the mails, which we do not get every day, for we are 12 miles from Cave City, the nearest point on the railroad. I have not learned what days the mails will go out yet, but I will try and write you as often as I can. We may possibly have to stay here for some time, and perhaps all summer, unless we are driven out by the rebels, which might possibly happen, but not without giving them a taste of our mettle first before we go. So we got the beginnings of the fort. March 21st, just a few days later, he writes that the 5th Indiana Cavalry camped about a mile south of us, and they pulled up stakes and moved around behind us and camped in an apple orchard. They went so far that they burned up a lot of the hay and corn that they couldn't take with them. I suppose that when they got the 107th Illinois Volunteers behind them, they were safe. Colonel Graham came along during the night and reported he had killed a rebel captain while on his scout and scattered the rest, about 700 in number, and took a few prisoners, and says there is no enemy any place near that could find more than them he chased. We commenced making fortifications this morning with 100 men. A lot of activity on the hill. The engineer says that if we are not disturbed for 3 weeks yet, we can hold out against a pretty large force. We sent an escort this morning to convey 16 pieces of artillery to this fort. When we get them and get our works complete, we can hold our own pretty easy. I had to laugh last night. Some of the boys when we was called out. Some of them was running in every direction and could not find anything they wanted, and the boys say that one man that was paroled some time ago and went home went out into the brush and could not be found. I did not see him, and no one has seen him since. We also had some butternuts in the guardhouse last night. They tried to pass out by our pickets without a pass, so they got marched into camp. We have got our tent raised up on timber again, and have bunks put up to sleep on, for we don't fancy sleeping on the ground while it is so cold and damp. We only had to work at it 2 days until we had things put up pretty snug. We split out puncheons to build our bunks, or patent bedsteads, with which we build here on a large scale, and they're not very nice. We are only about 30 miles from Bowling Green and 30 miles from the Tennessee line. I don't know how far we are from the Ohio River, for it has been so long since I have seen a map that I have almost forgot how the country lays. You can look on the map and find where we are stationed. I wrote you a letter the other day and told you what county we were in, but it will do no harm to name it again. We are in Barren County. And he goes on to say, I've been out drilling a little while and now resume my pen to write some more to you. I fear that you won't be satisfied with the way I answered your letter about you coming down here to stay. If I knew where you could stay here and be safe, I would gladly have you come. But with the uncertainty of staying here any length of time, besides being in danger all the time, I think it best for you not to come here to stay any length of time. You know but little about camp life, and a camp is a poor place for a woman and child, even with the protection of a husband. If we are likely to stay here this summer and things get quiet again, I would like for you to come and stay with me a week or two, for I may possibly not get to come home for some time. But for the present, it's unsafe for you to come while we are liable to have to leave on a moment's notice. He also returned the letters Lottie had been sending to him with that letter. By March 28th, so they've been here the 17th, so 11 days, he writes to Lottie. Now this time the fort has been named, it was first named Camp Joe Kelly, then it was named Fort Hobson when he's writing these letters, and then it later became Fort Williams. Wesley is well and hearty, and him and David Willis was running around yesterday looking at some of the Kentucky girls. They came to the post that I was on, but they had no pass and had to return to camp. It is no uncommon occurrence to see the Kentuckians get into a fight and throw brickbats, axes, and everything they can get a hold of at one another. I heard one of the boys say a while ago that he saw a woman throw an axe at her husband's head and came within an inch of hitting him in the head. I will stop now writing such foolishness and try to write about something else that would be more interesting. To you, George. It's interesting. We need to know more about what was going on in Glasgow with all of this fighting among the people. And I think I've gone so long. This is letter number 57 that George wrote, dated July 13th, 1863. This was actually the next to last letter that he wrote from Fort Williams. And obviously it is to Lottie. And in that letter, he did something I'm sure the military would not really appreciate, and that was he drew a scale drawing of the fort in the letter to his wife, because he wanted her to see what he had been building and where he was. So this is that sketch. That's a little bit enlarged section. If you look at this, it's just like the fort. He didn't miss anything. And the scale is actually pretty good. So you've got George's drawing of Fort Williams in April of 1863 on the left, U.S. Engineers drawing of the fort in November of 1863, and you've got a photograph of the fort as it exists today on the far right. He left here, along with all of his fellow soldiers, of course, and went to Scottsville. And there they camped on the banks of the Barren River. They went into Scottsville at one point, and there he talks about, well, He wasn't there, he came back to Glasgow, only there a few days. But in May of 1863, he writes to Lottie about their daily schedule, which is fascinating. My dear wife, I will now tell you something of our doings in camp. We have to get up in the morning at 4:30 to answer roll call. We have 1 hour and a half to get our breakfast in, and then those that are on fatigue duty have to go to work at 7:30. Guard mounting and relieving outpost. 8:30 is battalion drill. We drill till 11 o'clock and then come in, get our dinners, and answer to roll call at 12 o'clock. Company drill is at 2 o'clock. Dress parade is at 5 o'clock. Roll call is at 6 o'clock. Tattoo and roll call again at 8:30, and anyone absent without leave at any of these roll calls is severely punished. The reason of so many roll calls is to keep the men as close to camp as possible. Yet there are some that get out, and they are sometimes marched in again in a rather unpleasant way. I must close for a few minutes to make out the morning report for the orderly. It tells a little bit about what's going on in the area, revealing that the people here have all their corn planted, that is, those that intend to plant any. And there's a good many farms laying idle with fences all burned and houses left vacant and sometimes burned to the ground and all that was in them. And their inhabitants have gone we know not where and could care less, for there is few unconditional Union citizens in this part of the state as any place else. There was a minister of the Presbyterian Church in Glasgow, ordered one of our men and his wife out of the church 2 weeks ago. The man came back to camp and reported to the colonel, and Kelly went down and made the old cuss apologize for his conduct toward a soldier and his wife, and it was a fine thing. For the preacher, then there was no other soldiers there, or they would have mobbed him in less time than it takes me to write to you about it. Interestingly, that shows up in the church minutes over at the Presbyterian Church, and so we knew that happened. And that meeting afterwards was resulted in a meeting of all the preachers in Glasgow, and they were ordered to always be sure that they prayed for Abraham Lincoln and the preservation of the Union, and if they didn't, they would pay consequences. Well, I discovered that a man named Ezekiel Foreman was that pastor, and he didn't follow that order. And the result was that the Presbyterians had their church empty and turned into a horse stable. And that would be a consequence. So the Presbyterians then met in a room that had belonged to the Methodist Church up on Washington Street, where the telephone building is now. Also in May of 1863, George tells Lottie, I went on a fishing excursion the other day and had fisherman's luck as far as the fish were concerned. I then went in and washed off and sat around and looked at the scenery, which was as nice as I ever saw in my life, and I saw one spring of water that I must describe. It came out of a hill between two solid rocks, and where it come out, the stream was about 5 feet wide and about 8 inches thick, all in one solid sheet of water. It was the nicest spring I ever saw. The name of the stream that it went to was Beaver Creek, and it runs 2 miles from the camp. I wish we could find that place today. In May 13th, the next week, he writes to Lottie, I'm going to give you a description of our camp, which I believe I have never done yet. So he's working hard to think of things to write to Lottie about. I did think that I would draw off a plot of our camp, but I will try and to describe it as well as I can without you you can see by looking at the plot of the fort that I sent where our camp is. Our streets in camp run east to west, and they're 20 feet wide. At the west end of our streets is what we call the color line, where we hold dress parade, and at the east end of the streets is our kitchens and or the place where we cook and eat our grub. The east of our kitchens is about 6 rods in the company officers' tents in a row running north and south. Then the tents of field officers are 3 rods in the rear of the company officers and in the rear of the center of the regiment. The companies are placed according to letters. Company A on the north, Company K on the south, Company F is on the right of center. Then we have our streets each set aside with cedar trees, which gives them a nice appearance. The officers' tents have cedars set out in front of them. The mess that I belong to has an old tent put up to eat in, close to the kitchen, so you can see we're pretty nicely situated considering everything, and we generally make ourselves at home and board at the same place, except sometimes when we can get out and buy something a little extra to eat. Following week's letter, my dear wife, I am rather of the opinion that I'm taking the scurvy, and there is a good many in this regiment that have it pretty bad. My leg and ankle pains me some and is swelled considerable and is somewhat inflamed. But I can content myself and keep still. I think it'll be all right. That is, my leg will be all right in a few days. I shall now write you something else, and it may appear somewhat ridiculous, but it is nevertheless true. Last Thursday afternoon, we had to turn over our tents to the quartermaster and draw other new tents. What they are called is dog tents. And one tent is allowed for 2 men, and on the march each man has to carry 1/2 tent, which is not very large and weighs 2 pounds. The size of the tent, or the size of 1/2 tent, is about 6 feet square, and the 2 halves buttoned together at the top. Tents can be buttoned so as to form a long row, but they are very low and unhandy, but having to carry them when we march is what gets more than anything else. And another thing for this, the commander of this regiment, to make us appear like gentlemen on all and every occasion, then makes us live like dogs in dog tents. It is more than enough to cause the soldier to be pleased and satisfied. But it is no use being discouraged, and we may as well just look on the bright side of the question as the dark side. And a general thing, the boys are having considerable fun over the dog tents. The next morning, after we drawed our tents, when the bugle was blowed for roll call, you never heard such barking as the boys made. They imitated from the bulldog down to the little rat terrier, and they would frequently break out in a fight in imitations of dogs. But enough of this for the present, as I think I've written enough about our tents to satisfy you that they are anything but agreeable to live in, but it is the best policy to quietly submit to anything that can be enforced on them, for it has been many days since this company came very near being put under arrest for speaking their minds. Wesley has gotten sick, and George is still sick. So by the end of May, he writes to Lottie that all his hair had fallen out and had come in black and curly, which was not natural for him. And he also starts to reveal that Glasgow had a number of Civil War hospitals, as we would call them, but they were private homes. And a soldier could go and stay with a willing homeowner to be taken care of. And the cost was $3 a week for the soldier to pay personally, not the U.S. Army. And he writes about these various places and families that are taking care of the soldiers and scattered around Glasgow. By June, he writes, I seek myself today to write you a few lines to let you know how I'm getting along. I'm not well, and it is now going on 2 weeks since I felt well. I have the diarrhea, and it appears to be pretty hard to stop. I am taking medicine to stop it every day. Some days I feel tolerable well, and then not so well for a day or two at a time. I'm getting rather thin in flesh and feel pretty weak. Wesley is about the same way that I am, and there's perhaps over 100 of this regiment that are unfit for duty on account of diarrhea. It was not reported here that the rebels had attacked a freight train near Elizabethtown and burned it, and the mail train was not allowed to attempt to come through yesterday, meaning he didn't get any mail. And there, he comes back to Glasgow in July from that trek down into Allen County. They thought they were going to Gallatin, Tennessee, but when they got to Scottsville, their orders changed, and they were to go to Tompkinsville instead. By this time, George is quite sick, and it's a tough time for him. The troops had to walk, and he was too weak to walk. And they put him on a horse, and he found he was so sick that that made him feel worse to be on a horse. And finally, they put him on a wagon. Unfortunately, the commanding officer ordered that if you couldn't carry your knapsack and your belongings, you had to leave them by the side of the road. So George lost his dog tent and his clothes, everything he had with him except what was on his body, which included those letters from Lottie. We learn about one person in Glasgow that's pretty fascinating in this second section of Glasgow letters, and his name is Obadiah E. Curd. And Obadiah Curd was a man who was accepting sick soldiers into his home and taking care of. Now, for George, that became a bad situation because he ran out of money and he couldn't afford to pay $3 a week anymore, and he had to go be sick back in the camp. But trying to learn a little bit more about Obadiah Curd, we can find him in the 1860 census that he was working as a saddler. It seems he's living near downtown Glasgow, I believe the rear of the west side of the square. His next door neighbor was Elizabeth Bybee. Elizabeth's husband had been one of the victims of the cholera epidemic in 1854, and there's much written about him in Franklin Gorin's book. He was quite well-to-do, and Preston Ritter was also a saddler. His neighbors were merchants, grocers, harness makers, and saddlers. His first wife was Elizabeth Ritter, and she's buried in Mumford Crenshaw Cemetery. His second wife was America Dickinson, and she was a daughter of William Dickinson and Catherine Hall. And George was staying in their home in 1863 here in Glasgow. And just for those who know old families and local history, the Curd's daughter, Sarah Ellen, married Marshall Warner. Their daughter Emma was Mrs. Judge George Bohannon. And so a very well-known family in this community. But Mr. Curd was trying his best to help George, not having the best of luck. He writes to his wife, I'm not staying at the hospital now. I'm boarding with Mr. Curd as I came to the conclusion that I could not get to come home very soon, and the only way I had to do to get proper kind of diet was get boarding at a private house. I started out yesterday morning and got a place for Wesley and myself. Wesley was out of money, and I could not think of faring well myself, and let him stay at the hospital and suffer. And I don't think you will blame me for dividing up with him as long as I had any money to divide. And within 2 weeks, George was out of his money at $3 a week. There's one thing that we have plenty of here, and that is butter and milk, which I know I am remarkably fond of. The doctor says that milk was good for the diarrhea as anything we can get. Wesley and me stay here for 1 week unless we are ordered away sooner, and that will be as long as I have money to pay board. Wesley's getting considerable better and is in better spirits than he was when I came back. It says, I'm now sitting by the bedside of a sick boy from the 14th Illinois Cavalry that is staying here. He has typhoid fever very bad. I'm staying with him for a few minutes while his father, who is here waiting on him, has gone out for a few minutes to get him some medicine. But I'm afraid the medicine will never do him any good. I have not heard anything from the regiment since it left here last Sunday evening, but I suppose they are moving on after Morgan as fast as they can. But they can never catch Morgan, for his force is all mounted, and the most of ours are on foot. And there's no use to try and catch a set of well-mounted men, well acquainted with the country, and I thought that our generals had learned that much long ago. There's one thing they will do, and that is march the men around in this warm weather until they all be sick, and you would perhaps be surprised if I was to tell you that there was 106 privates and non-commissioned officers and 8 commissioned officers out of 9 companies that were so sick they couldn't go with the regiment when they left here Sunday evening. His last letter to Lottie from Glasgow was July the 21st, and in that letter he reveals to Lottie that when he arrived in Glasgow he was weighed, and he weighed 169 pounds. That was in March. By July he weighed 143 pounds, and he was losing all of his strength and his energy with dysentery. So they left here, and the U.S. Army decided to take these men by train to Lebanon Junction. So they had to march to Cave City. No train was coming for a couple of days, and so these sick men laid on the deck at the railroad station in Cave City until a train came to pick them up. Then there wasn't enough room for them, so they loaded them into an empty rail car where they had to stand up and be as close together as possible, all of these sick people. So we finally got to Lebanon Junction, and from there they went to Knoxville, Tennessee. So George is still very ill through all of this. And this is the letter, December 31st, advising Lottie's father that George had died. And his last letter to Lottie was on Christmas Eve of 1863. In that letter, he mentions that he had her letters with him and the lock of Cutie's hair, and that he burned the letters because he thought he would not live, and he didn't want anyone to read their personal letters, so he burned them. So unfortunately, those are gone. But December 31st, we have evidence that he died. Wesley McNulty wrote a postscript on a scrap of paper mentioning how George was buried, and he was buried in the Soldiers Cemetery in Knoxville. And the one thing that he did have with him when he died was the lock of Cutie's hair, and it stayed with him and with the letters. We don't know exactly when he died. The letter from Willie, who was a commander of the group, said that he died on December the 30th. Wesley said he died on December the 29th. And U.S. military records say he died on January the 1st. We don't really know exactly when George died. But after researching and transcribing and doing all this, I had to go find George in Knoxville. And there is his tombstone in grave A245 in the military cemetery. There are some subsequent letters where Lonnie is wanting to send someone from Illinois to Knoxville to get George's body and bring him back to Illinois to be buried. And it was apparent from the letter it was going to be quite a saga. There was a letter back to her that said this is not the right time of year to move a body. You should wait until it's cold weather again. He was never moved. And so that is George. And I think we can sort of claim him as one of our own, because he's told us some things about the layout of Fort Williams and what went on there on an hour-to-hour basis. Things about our town that we didn't really know. And it's very helpful. And one of the things that the Fort Williams Commission is working toward doing is taking excerpts from these letters that are specific to Fort Williams and using those on new interpretive panels inside the fort, so that visitors who visit the fort can tour the fort and actually learn something about what went on within those walls. And I think it actually provides us with an opportunity to have a premier fort historic site. Other forts don't have such things as these personal accounts of the letter and photographs and that sort of thing. So, any questions? Yes?
Yes, do we know his rank?
I do not. I'll have to check that.
The reason I
I'm sure
asked
I had
that,
it, I just don't recall.
The reason I asked that, it sounds like he was a company clerk. And the reason I say that, he handled the morning report, gave it to the orderly, and he was doing accounting, company pay. Those are two functions that a company clerk would be doing.
Makes perfect sense.
And he also spoke in there of the number of people he was saying that were down sick in different regiments. He would have that information, being a company clerk and having access to records.
He had some responsibilities. That was very clear. Yes, ma'am.
The present owner of these letters, is he or she related to the Messer family, and how did they come to be in possession of the person that has them now?
They were owned by one person, and they did scans of them, and I got copies of all the scans. So we have a scan of all letters. For whatever reason, a antique ephemera dealer in Chicago got the letters, and to my horror chose to divide them up and sell them one by one on eBay, which is just a shame that you had this wonderful collection, and it's a real treasure, and it's just horrifying that they're not together anymore. We have about 20 or so that we got for Glasgow.
So now, you gave this talk once before. All the letters, am I wrong, but weren't they all online at that time?
They are,
They're still online?
to my knowledge, they are.
That could disappear at any time.
They are. The transcription that's with them is not necessarily real accurate. I've gone through that and transcribed again. There are a lot of names, places, and people that I recognize. Knowing
someone
history.
locally.
Exactly. And they've got things that are entirely wrong, and there are some places that the transcription is just not right.
So where did you get the picture of George Musser? Who has that?
National Archives has it.
Okay.
So they're aware of George and his story. And I think he's also got the photograph on fine degree as well.
Yeah, because I was wondering if it actually had a mark on there by the photographer. And
Not to my knowledge. I can't see the back of it.
that's the problem.
I can only see the front. Yes.
The 20 letters that Glasgow has, how and where are they preserved?
Part of them are in my house. And part of them are in Benny Dickinson's house with Sandra. And we mutually agreed when we were buying them that they would eventually come here to the cultural center so that they could be preserved. But before that, because of our interest in Fort Williams, we want to play with them first and glean as much from them as possible. Okay, thank you all.